Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in Canada and around the world. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Tyler McCann, CAPI's Chief Engagement Officer, and I am pleased to host our Doctoral Fellows webinar, Say It Ain't Soil. Before we begin, an important note about language interpretation. This webinar includes simultaneous interpretation in English and French. Please ensure you have selected the correct language that you will listen in. To select the appropriate language, please locate and click on the globe icon on the bottom taskbar of this window, or more if you are on a mobile device, and select either English or French. While we are all meeting virtually, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the First Nations on whose traditional territories we sit as we watch our screens. I am in Western Quebec, and CAPI's head office is in Ottawa. So I would like to recognize the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, whose traditional and unceded territory we are and would be gathered upon today. As we look forward to the future of the agri-food system and what it means for the land, it is important to acknowledge the long history of Canada's Indigenous people and their connection to the land. It is also important to underscore the essential need to engage all perspectives in conversations about the agri-food system. I know many of you are familiar with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, but I want to introduce CAPI for those who may not be. CAPI is an independent policy think tank focusing solely on the agri-food sector, bringing insight, evidence, and creative solutions to agri-food policymakers by creating venues for critical conversations, explaining research results to a broader audience, and being a connector between those who have creative ideas to contribute and those who are making impactful policy decisions. While CAPI was established 17 years ago, the work it does has never been more important. As you know, there are major opportunities and risks on the horizon. This past year has reminded us of the importance of an agri-food system that is resilient to disruption. We also need a system that can meet increasing global demand for high-quality food and a system that enables us to do our part to tackle climate change. At the same time, we must set Canada's agri-food system apart in an increasingly competitive and complex global environment. We need to find new ways to drive growth through innovation, creative thinking, and ideas rooted in science and good policy. Canada has certain comparative advantages, but we cannot rest on our laurels. If we are to increase trade and international cooperation, we must build leverage and influence international rulemaking. We must find untapped opportunities, grow and scale, attract investments in value-added processing, and create more sustainable value chains. Put simply, we must find ways to produce more and better with less. We can do this together at CAPI. But we can only do this together at CAPI if we have the right financial partnerships in place. It is through these partnerships that CAPI can continue to be the institution where Canada's agri-food system comes together to do bold, creative, strategic policy thinking, and an institution that produces groundbreaking content, critical connections, and bold communications, all of which are actionable, consumable, and timely. From the beginning, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada has been CAPI's significant financial partner. We would not be here today without the significant investment from the department, and we are grateful for their continued support. However, a more diversified funding model is essential for CAPI to have a sustainable future. This new approach to financial partnerships will only be possible because of funders who believe in advancing the agri-food and agriculture sector, funders like you. There are many different ways to support the work of the Institute, as seen listed here, and we are actively seeking funding partners on our work going forward. One of the ways you can partner with CAPI is supporting programs like the CAPI Doctoral Fellowship Program and the various CAPI webinars held throughout the year. Today's webinar is sponsored by Farm Credit Canada. I'd like to thank Farm Credit Canada for their support for today's event and the Doctoral Fellowship Program. Your support has helped make research on important topics like soil health and Canadian agriculture possible. Commitment from stakeholders and partners like Farm Credit Canada and stakeholders and partners like you are vital. It's urgent for us all to come together to intensify our efforts as agriculture and agri-food can be essential solution providers for the economy, environment, health, food, and global security, but creative policy changes are essential. Please reach out to either me, myself, or Janelle Bodie, our Director of Fundraising, to explore the different funding opportunities and join the CAPI mailing list to ensure you stay up to date on future CAPI webinar and research throughout the year. We look forward to connecting with you. The 2020-2022 CAPI Doctoral Fellowship Program is an interdisciplinary group of young scholars who are working on a particular aspect of soil health and Canadian agriculture. Our first fellowship took place from 2017 to 2019 with a focus on water and agriculture. I know we have some of our alumni in the virtual audience today, so I want to welcome you back. In the first year of the program, each doctoral fellow is required to produce an individual report, which can all be found on the CAPI website. You will hear more on each of these reports and the fellows' research today. In the second and final year of the fellowship, the fellows will collaborate on a group project on the topic of soil health and Canadian agriculture. So we thank you for your questions and insights today as the fellows begin to work together on this group report. This spring has highlighted the importance of soil health. A healthy soil is a more resilient one, better able to help crops combat dry conditions and variable weather, and better to help Canada find solutions to fighting climate change. It's an important discussion today, and I'd like to highlight the important work that our moderator today has done on today's topic. Today's moderator is Senator Rob Black. Senator Black has worked in the rural agriculture and leadership arenas for much of his working career. He has a close involvement in 4-H and other leadership programs such as Junior Farmers and the Advanced Agricultural Leadership Program. He credits his involvement in these programs with allowing him to develop the skills that would lead him to apply to be a senator. He's been involved in 4-H for 45 years in all aspects of the program at the local, provincial, and national levels, and is a past president of the Canadian 4-H Council. Senator Black was also Ward 5 representative on the Wellington County Council. He's been manager of the Ontario Research and Development Challenge Fund and president of the Ontario Agricultural Hall of Fame Association and the Wellington County Historical Society. Senator Black worked with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs for 15 years. He then spent a short time with the Ontario soybean growers before accepting the job of his dreams, executive director of the Centre for Rural Leadership, which morphed into the Rural Ontario Institute. In 2012, in recognition of Senator Black's significant contributions to 4-H across Canada over many years, he received the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. In 2013, he was awarded the Outstanding Leadership Program Director Award from the International Association of Programs for Agricultural Leadership, and in 2016, he was made an honorary member of the Canadian 4-H Council. Senator Black applied to be a senator in July 2016 after some prompting from his son, Taylor. In November 2016, he received notice that his application was unsuccessful. He then had the opportunity to tweak it and resubmit it. In February 2018, he received a call from the Prime Minister summoning him to the Senate to represent the province of Ontario. The Prime Minister told Rob specifically that he wanted him to bring his background in agriculture, rural community development, and leadership development to the Senate. We are all grateful that he was given this opportunity. In February 27, 2018, he was sworn in as a senator. Since then, he's been working on several issues of importance to Canadians through his role and is a member of the Standing Committees on Agriculture and Forestry, Social Affairs, Science and Technology, Rules, Procedures and the Rights of Parliament, and the Joint Committee on the Library of Parliament. Senator Black and his wife Julie live north of Fergus and have 4 grown children and 3 grandsons. Now, over to you, Senator Black.
Thanks very much, Tyler. Thanks for the warm welcome. I'm certainly pleased to moderate today's panel discussion, which consists of an impressive lineup of young scholars working in various disciplines, all with one common goal. How do we improve soil health in Canadian agricultural soils to ensure future prosperity of Canadian agriculture? Each doctoral fellow has been asked to provide a short overview of their research. This will be followed by a moderated discussion and questions from me and from the audience. And just as a reminder, we do encourage questions that might help the fellows brainstorm ways in which their work overlaps with others and possible research focus for their group report, which Tyler mentioned in the second and final year of the program. I'd like to now introduce each of the doctoral fellows in the order that they'll be presenting before we get the panel underway. So it's my pleasure to introduce Hannah Lieberman. Hannah is a PhD student at the University of McGill. Her research is focused on how flooding impacts carbon and phosphorus dynamics under different agricultural land management practices. Hannah is interested in understanding how land management practices affect soil quality, carbon, and nutrient cycling, and how these relate to climate change. Hannah was born and raised in Berkeley, California, and received her BSc in biology from Grinnell College in Iowa. Before starting graduate school at McGill, Hannah completed a research fellowship at Gobabeb Namib Research Institute in Namibia. She worked at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on invasive species management and completed a postdoc internship at Archbold Biological Station. Second up will be Callum Morrison, who is investigating cover cropping on the Canadian prairies under Professor Yvonne Lawley at the University of Manitoba. Callum's primary area of focus is conducting the first cover crop survey on the Canadian prairies, and from 2021, also in Ontario. Callum is also investigating the effect of cover crops on soil moisture availability at long-term crop rotation sites. Callum first traveled to Manitoba during his third year of his BSc in Agricultural Science at Scotland's Rural College during an exchange at the University of Arkansas, and was immediately interested in the prairie landscape and way of life. Callum hopes his research will provide real benefit to Canadian farmers who are considering adopting cover crops. Our third in our lineup will be Elise Sampson. She is an agronomist and a PhD interested in soil conservation. Elise recently received her PhD from Laval University and the Agro-Campus West. Together with some of the world's leading researchers in soil science, she investigates the best ways to store carbon in agricultural soils while improving their fertility and resilience. She is currently completing a postdoc fellowship at the Colorado State University, where she is helping to develop a mechanistic predictive model that captures process-based understanding of soil organic matter dynamics as a function of location, environmental conditions, and management practices in order to foster the development of a soil-based climate mitigation strategies. And finally, we'll hear from Lisa Ashton, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Geomatics at the University of Guelph. Lisa is driven by identifying ways to align and integrate environmental, economic, and societal goals. Her current PhD research is focused on this by exploring how agriculture can be a source for solutions to climate change while producing enough food for a growing population. Lisa has also contributed to a range of projects that focus on building sustainable food systems. Lisa has an honors BSc in sociology and international development with a minor in political science from the University of Ottawa and an MSc in global change, ecosystem science and policy from University College in Dublin, Ireland, and Justus Liebig University in Gießen, Germany. So without any further delay, I would welcome our first candidate, and that will be Hannah Lieberman. Hannah, over to you.
Hi, give me 1 second. Thank you so much, Senator Black, for that introduction. Once again, my name is Hannah Lieberman, and I will be presenting an overview of my report entitled Experimental Flooding Changes Both Persistent and Bioavailable Carbon, Nitrogen, and Phosphorus in Agricultural Soil. And while my report does talk about nitrogen and phosphorus, for the sake of time, I'm only going to be talking about my carbon data, but I'm happy to answer any questions about it during the panel or after. So with climate change, Quebec is expected to experience increases in flood intensity and duration, meaning that more land will become flooded for longer periods of time and at higher levels. And this is especially true for seasonal flooding. And flooding can really transform the soil environment. While some research focuses on the horizontal movement of flooding in a field, I'm going to be focusing on the vertical movement of flooding throughout the soil profile. Carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus is vulnerable to shifts with flooding, and that can result in potential loss of these substrates, either through leaching or carbon mineralization, so respiration. And flood intensity and duration may impact how these shifts occur and to what degree. And it's unclear currently how carbon and nitrogen phosphorus dynamics change with flood changes in agricultural soil. And agroecosystems may be particularly vulnerable to these shifts as they experience a high level of disturbance and may be less resilient as a result. So in order to understand what I'm talking about when I mean these shifts, I've created a simplified conceptual diagram where you have the mineral-associated organic matter pool, which is considered the stable carbonaceous pool. And there is some exchange between this and the biologically available pool, which of course is important for agricultural productivity as it's the source of nitrogen and phosphorus for plants. And microbes can also uptake carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus from this pool into their microbial biomass, where it's stored. And when these cells die, these microbes die and the cells lyse, they're more likely to go back into this mineral-bound stable pool. However, with flooding, previous studies have shown that this stable mineral-bound carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus can be released into the biologically available pool. And it's unclear what happens to this carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus during and post-flooding. So we wanted to know how flood duration and intensity, both independently and interactively, impact carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus dynamics during as well as post-flood. So once the soil has returned to pre-flood conditions and agricultural soil, as well as how the microbial community responds to these shifts. So we did a short-term laboratory incubation experiment. We used soil collected from a corn-soybean rotation field in southern Quebec, and we exposed the soil to 3 different flood durations, 30 minutes, 24 hours, and 1 week, at 2 different flood intensities. Our moderate treatment was 50% gravimetric water content, and this represents flooding after a heavy rainfall event. Whereas our severe treatment, we kept the soil under standing water, and this represents seasonal flooding. And we also wanted to know if the shifts we may see, if these last post-flood, once the soil has dried. So we dried a subset after the flood duration period, back to the pre-flood gravimetric water content, back to the pre-flood conditions. And so on this graph, the blue lines represent the half-hour flood duration, the orange represents the 24 hours, and the solid lines are the severe flood intensity, whereas the dashed lines are the moderate flood intensity. And we have mineral-associated carbon, that stable pool, pre-flood, during flood, and post-flood. And we actually saw a surprising increase in this mineral-bound, this stable carbon, post-flood, but only in the week-long treatment, suggesting that duration has a greater impact on how mineral-bound carbon moves. For our water extractable carbon, so this biologically available carbon, we did see much more shifting, where all our treatments except our half-hour moderate intensity did increase during flood, and these increased levels remained post-flood, although at lower levels. And as you can see, flood intensity shaped how much the degree of the increase. So there was a greater increase in carbon with that severe treatment. And so once we understood that there were these shifts, we wanted to understand how the microbial community responds. So we looked at the exocellular enzyme activity, so that represents the microbial activity. And we did find that there was a positive correlation for both flood intensities with all the flood durations, with an increase in available carbon increasing activity. So the microbes were able to sustain their activity during the flood and actually increased it. So overall, what we found is that flooding can really change carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus in soil, and that these changes remain post-flooding. So flooding does act as a threat to agricultural land with climate change. We also did find that the microbial community responds to these increases in available substrates, which is a good thing, because if they're intaking more carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus into their biomass, there's less likely that it will be lost. And so microbes really might be key to retain this carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus with increases in flooding. And previous studies have shown that greater roots increase greater microbial activity. So Farming practices like buffer strips and cover crops that increase perennial root biomass may be a simple way to make sure that our soils stay healthy with increases in flooding. So I'd just like to thank everyone, and I am looking forward to the panel discussion and your questions. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Hannah. Interesting, very interesting. Now I would like to call upon Callum Morrison. Callum, over to you.
Hello, everyone. So my project is called Cover Cropping on the Prairies, and my professor is Dr. Yvonne Lawley at the University of Manitoba. So first of all, I just want to make sure everyone is on the same page. So what exactly do we mean by a cover crop? Well, the simplest definition is a non-cash crop grown to provide cover to the soil. And these can be grown for many different reasons, including to reduce erosion, build soil carbon, improve biodiversity. But for us, it's the key definition is the intention to provide an agronomic or an environmental benefit as opposed to an immediate financial gain from producing a cash crop. And these are either grown in the shoulder season, which is after cash crop harvest, until the planting of the next cash crop in the fall, or over the entirety of the growing season, known as a full season cover crop. And in our definition of cover crop, we have included cover crops that at the end of their life will be grazed to terminate them. So what is the importance of cover cropping? Why are people growing cover crops? And there's absolutely dozens of potential benefits growing cover crops, and these are often very specific to the intention of what the individual farmer wants to achieve. Cover crops can be seen like a toolbox, with each different type of cover crop able to perform different tasks, some of them very well, some of them not quite so well. And these benefits can be economic, potentially boosting farm revenue, quite often seen as a long-term investment. They can have benefits to the climate through carbon sequestration and changes in the albedo effect. They can build soil health, feeding soil biology, and also help reduce erosion. Here's a photo I took in one of my crop field trials on the left, where you can see that wind erosion on the prairies is a massive problem, and cover crops could be part of that solution. So why exactly did we feel we needed to do the sort of research I'm doing on the prairies? Well, even though cover crops are becoming increasingly popular on the Canadian prairies, they're still only really used by a small number of early adopter farmers. And really, we needed a survey to actually measure the current adoption and see why these farmers are adopting cover crops, how they are, how they're using them. And then from that information, we can build on that and guide future policy. So what were our objectives of our 2019 survey? Well, we really needed to know that extent of cover cropping. We really wanted to know why and how cover crops are grown, but also importantly, we wanted to give farmers a direct voice to researchers and policymakers to let them know what questions they have and where they think our research should be going to assist them. So what exactly did we learn? Well, I remember speaking to my professor, and we would be amazed if we would have got just 80 respondents on the prairies, because we really had no idea where we were on the prairies with cover crop adoption. And we found out that there's at least 211 early adopters on the prairies, and these early adopters grew over 83,500 acres of cover crops. And we found that the primary reason why farmers are growing cover crops on the prairies, just over 90%, is to provide benefits to soil health. We also learned how farmers are able to integrate cover crops into their farms across a wide variety of ecological and climatic regions across the prairies. And we found that they are grown in rotations with dozens of different types of cash crops, from the most popular cash crops in the prairies, such as canola and wheat, right the way down to niche cash crops. And here's some maps that we have made from our first year data. And what I want you to take away from here is that cover cropping is not just in a few small areas of the extreme south of the prairies. They are found as far north as you can go in terms of agriculture in the prairies, in drier areas and wetter areas, which is something that was really important to take away from this. And what impacts do we hope that the 2019 survey will have? So I'd say one of the biggest things is finally we know it is possible to grow cover crops successfully across a wide variety of locations, climates, and growing windows across the prairies. We also hope that this information will make cover cropping seem a more achievable goal for many farmers. We really want to highlight what farmers believe is important for future research and extension. And we really hope that this will act as a conversation starter for the future of cover crop policy. So what are our next steps? Well, the report I'm talking about is based on our 2019 data, and I've been gathering data over the 2020 season. And our 2020 cover crop survey has expanded to include not just people who grew cover crops on the prairies, but also those who did not grow cover crops, which is a very important expansion. And we also expanded from the prairies to welcome a fourth province, Ontario, which has been growing cover crops for quite considerably longer. So we also included some additional benefits that are additional objectives that are very important for policymakers and researchers to find out about. So for the cover croppers, we want to know what benefits farmers have actually seen and in what time period they have seen these benefits. We want to find out what challenges farmers have actually faced while growing cover crops. And we wanted to know what farmers believed would support them growing their cover crops. And for non-cover croppers, we really want to learn what challenges actually limit cover crop adoption for them, and then what would enable those farmers to adopt cover crops. So that's an overview of my project, and thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Callum. Good stuff. Now I'd like to ask Elise Sampson to take the floor. Elise, you're on.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Here. Thank you so much, Senator. So I am really happy to give you a brief overview of my CAPI report, which is entitled Healthy Agricultural Soils, a Simple Solution to Climate Change and Resilient Agri-Food Systems. So to place this project in its context, I just want to remind everyone that globally, cultivated soils have lost from 20 to 70% of their carbon. This loss has been accompanied by a depletion of soil resilience and soil fertility. And we've also observed a declining trend in productivity on over 20% of the world's arable land. However, the good news is that regenerative agricultural practices could help reverse these trends by returning organic matter to agricultural soils, because that's where it belongs. So by adopting best management practices in agricultural soils, it would be possible to sequester from 2 to 3 gigatons of carbon per year. This could help offset from 20 to 35% of global anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. And this is really considered as a win-win solution, since it could help fight climate change, but also improve soil health and resilience, and therefore contribute to future food security. However, one question still remains, because soil-based climate solutions seem like the perfect solution to climate change and to food security. But is this really the panacea, or are there any trade-offs between yield, soil health, and carbon storage? So the objective of my project was to compare on 2 brunisols with very contrasting textures the long-term effect of different tillage intensities, residue management strategies, and fertilizer sources, including mineral fertilizers and manures, on cash crop yields, but also on soil health and soil carbon stocks. So as for crop yield, the effect of conservation management practices on crop yield varied greatly depending not only on crop type, but also on soil type and on yearly meteorological conditions. So as an example here, I'm just going to present the effect of reduced tillage when compared to moldboard plowing over the years. So here is the result we've had in the silty clay soil over the years. As you can see, at first there was very little effect of tillage intensity on crop yield. However, starting in 2013, there was a buildup, and reduced tillage really, yields were really higher under reduced tillage and moldboard plowing for every crop type. However, the story was very different in the sandy loam soil. So in the sandy loam soil, there was relatively little effect of tillage intensity on wheat and soybean yield. However, corn yield was always lower under reduced tillage and moldboard plowing. But this was only true when reduced tillage was combined with residue restitution to soil. And this is probably due to a mulching effect with the presence of residues at the surface of the soil that really slowed down soil warming in the spring and could have also contributed to nitrogen immobilization in the spring as well. So if the effect of the conservation management on crop yield was really variable, we really observed the positive effect of conservation management practices on surface soil health indicators in both soils. So this is a graph where I've presented the effect of conservation management practices versus conventional management practices. So brown bars represent the difference between the use of manure versus mineral fertilizer, and green is residue return when compared to harvested, and in black you have the effect of reduced tillage versus moldboard plowing. So as you can see, soil organic carbon, microbial biomass content, and aggregate mean wide diameter were greater under conservation management practices than under conventional management practices in the surface soil. However, when you're interested at the effect of different management practices on carbon soil stock, you can't only focus on the 10 first centimeters of soil. You have to consider the entire soil profile. And when we did that, we've realized that subsoil carbon stock changes could sometimes be greater and different from those observed in the topsoil layer. So conservation management practices did not always result in whole soil carbon storage due to adverse and really important and great effect of management practices in subsoil layers. So in conclusion, this project showed that soil-based climate change mitigation strategies might sometimes, not always, but sometimes create a certain trade-off between agronomic and environmental services provided by agricultural soils. So I think there is really a need to better understand and measure and predict how management practices affect both soils and crops. And this would also help to develop tools that could help inform governmental policies and maybe even eventually internalize all ecosystem services provided by agricultural soils. And to me, this would be a very smart investment because in the words of Dr. Swaminathan, agronomist and recipient of the first Nobel Food Prize, if agriculture goes wrong, nothing else will have a chance to go right. So thank you very much, and I'll be very happy to answer your question.
Thank you very much, Marie-Elise. And I wrote down that quote, if agriculture goes wrong, nothing else will have a chance to go right. What prophetic words. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Moving on now to hear from Lisa Ashton. Lisa, take the floor.
Great. I'm just going to share my screen here. Perfect. Yeah, so thank you so much for that introduction, Senator Black. So my report provides an overview of Canada's approach and pathways forward to implementing natural climate solutions in agriculture. And today I will present a background on the broader challenge at hand and then dive into the objectives, methods, results, and pathways forward that are presented in the report. And before I do all of that, I wanted to provide a brief overview of what natural climate solutions are. So natural climate solutions are conservation, restoration, and improved management actions that result in increases in carbon storage and/or avoided greenhouse gas emissions. Natural climate solutions also produce environmental and societal co-benefits, such as enhanced biodiversity and the conservation of culturally significant lands, which can both result from improved management of our native grasslands. Other examples of natural climate solutions have already been discussed, such as cover crops, improved nutrient management, such as adopting the 4 R's of nutrient application, and reduced tillage. It is also really important to note that natural climate solutions are not a silver bullet solution to climate change mitigation in agriculture. They must also be coupled with transitions away from fossil fuel use and advancements in our efficiencies and on-farm and along our supply chains to really achieve our greenhouse gas targets. So agriculture has definitely emerged as a sector that can make a really important contribution to Canada's net zero target. However, to realize this potential of being a climate solutions provider, further action and coordination within Canada is required. And this action includes the continued and also the further expansion of adoptions of natural climate solutions. And according to a recent ECCC report that presented emission projections based on the measures adopted of the most recent federal climate action plan, the combination of carbon sinks from forestry and other land uses, along with widespread implementation of natural climate solutions, and the proposed measures to reduce emissions from fertilizer use in agriculture are estimated to reduce our national emissions by 27 megatons of CO2 equivalent in 2030. And to put these emissions in context, they're roughly equal to the emissions that are coming from our waste sector today. So these projections and the increasing demand to identify and employ climate solutions in agriculture really signal a strong need for government, industry, and civil society to foster an enabling and coherent governance ecosystem that can support natural climate solutions adoption. So now getting into the report, the objective of my report is really to provide an overview of the actors and the different governance mechanisms that make up the current governance ecosystem that is influencing natural climate solutions in Canadian agriculture. And a deeper understanding of this present situation can really help inform emerging governance mechanisms to build upon existing ones and even complement them to better position Canada overall to realize its potential. And having this overview is also especially relevant today as the current governance ecosystem is really expanding, as new mechanisms are being further developed, such as industry-led carbon programs, and existing ones like environmental trusts are being repurposed to really position agriculture as a solutions provider to enhancing things like biodiversity and addressing climate change. So to develop the overview of the governance ecosystem, I conducted an environmental scan of websites, gray literature, and select academic literature that describe and in some cases examine the governance mechanisms that are currently influencing natural climate solution adoption today. And then to visually organize the scan, I drew upon Stewart 2013's model of multi-actor governance, which enables a really comprehensive view of the various mechanisms identified in the scan, and then organized based on their primary architect, whether that be industry, civil society, or government, or a combination of these. And overall, what I found in doing the scan is that the governance ecosystem that influences natural climate solutions is very diverse. It's growing exponentially, but it's uncoordinated. And this uncoordination appears to be the result of missing a few fundamental components, such as shared targets, strategic plans, and consistencies and frameworks across our measuring, reporting, and verifying systems. And this image on the right is just a sample of the more fulsome image that's provided in the report. And what it aims to do is really provide an outline of the different types of governance approaches that are taken. So whether they be solely by an individual actor, such as government or a government department, or through public-private and private-private partnerships. So to provide an example, looking on the Venn diagram at public co-management, which is on the left-hand side, kind of in the middle, these types of governance mechanisms require collaboration between government and civil society. And an example that's playing out currently is the delivery of cost share programs under the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, or of some of the cost share programs. And another example is private co-regulation, which is in the bottom in the middle. And these types of governance mechanisms require industry and civil society collaboration. And an example of that today is the recent development of Alice's New Acre Project initiative, Grazing Forward, which is in collaboration with Cargill and A&W. And now looking to pathways forward, a few of the key recommendations that I identified in the report from literature suggest a need for setting greenhouse gas targets within the agricultural sector and better identifying opportunities to integrate agriculture within national and subnational climate policy portfolios. And then complementary to having targets is developing a national roadmap or strategic plans that allow different actors to envision their role in meeting targets, but then also provides an opportunity for them to align their own objectives with those targets as well. And then in addition to having a target and a plan to reach that target, we also need to be better able to track our progress, which really underlines the importance of further developing robust measuring, reporting, and verification systems that enable us to have a concrete understanding of what the natural climate solutions adoption rate is, and then especially what their outcomes are. So what are they producing in terms of greenhouse gas reductions, and then as well as those co-benefits as well. And then looking more to the economic side of things, establishing clear market signals, such as incentives, can play a really important role in accelerating adoption. And developing clear market signals is inclusive of the expanding potential in carbon markets to fund natural climate solutions, but also looking to reform existing policies and subsidies that are having perverse effects on incentivizing climate change mitigation and innovation on the farms. And last but not least, encouragement at regional and local levels is identified in the literature as crucial to inform the design and development of governance mechanisms. And what this is really getting at is the importance of including agricultural producers and the design processes of the governance mechanisms that ultimately aim to encourage their participation and adoption. So lastly, while there definitely are challenges and barriers within the current governance ecosystem, Canada is really well positioned to build upon the recent rise in engagement and especially the funding commitments that we've recently seen towards natural climate solutions to foster a governance ecosystem that is not only coherent, but capable of realizing the climate change mitigation potential of agriculture. So that's all for me, and thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Lisa. And thanks to our 4 fellows today. Great presentations, right on time. And so that allows us to have the maximum amount of time for questions from me and from the group. So I'm going to start off and I'll go through the same order. So my first question is for Hannah. And Hannah, how does your research relate to the larger, broader policy framework that's in front of us and before us? And what are the policy implications of your research?
Yeah, so my study is a pretty mechanistic, less applied study than some of the other fellows, of course. So it's not necessarily direct application, but I think there's a surprisingly little amount of research, or we know less than you'd think, about how flooding impacts soil, especially in agricultural land, and just kind of having an understanding that things can change and maybe changing more rapidly brings attention to how that increases in flooding may really shift agricultural land. And it also, I think the microbial activity and this microbial response really points to increasing perennial root biomass as a way of mitigating. Of course, I haven't actually added any plants to my research yet, but I think that's probably a pretty good way to go.
So that leads into my next question. And how do you want to build in your research?
Yeah, so I'm just starting a field study in the Lac Saint Pierre watershed in Quebec, which is already experiencing increases in seasonal flooding. And I'm looking at soil in 3 different land management, which represent the disturbance gradient of the land. So I'm going from forest to pasture to corn and soybean rotation. And I'm looking at these same pools and how they shift with this flood legacy and how they differ between the land treatments. And I'm actually looking down to a meter within the soil to see how it's impacted throughout the soil profile.
Thanks very much. And we have one from the audience, and for you. Was soil compaction and water infiltration measured, and would that have changed the microbial activities after flooding, especially after a week?
So it wasn't measured. I'm sure. So my experimental design, the soil was all homogenized and it was started out pretty much the same amount. I'm sure that there was a degree of compaction or change within the structure that may have impacted it, but I didn't look at it. I think it's a good question.
All right, I have one more question for you of a general nature. What do we do with the knowledge, this knowledge that you've given us through your research? What do we do collectively? What would you like to see us do?
I think that's a good question. I think there needs to be more research and more attention to looking at how flooding will shift the land. And I think we also, farmers, policymakers, need to start thinking not only about what is the current flooding situation, but what might it be, what more land will be affected by it, and kind of looking forward and potentially changing practices or policies before the flooding increases in that area so that we can prevent carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus from shifting even before this increase in flooding occurs.
Thanks very much, Hannah. I'm going to move on to Callum. Callum, a general question. Do you see any synergies between your research and the other fellows that are joining with you this year?
Well, I see a tremendous amount of synergies going on between all 3 of our projects. Everyone in their reports mentions cover crops at some point, and I think that boils down to just the amazing ability of cover crops to be able to reach so many different goals and be such potentially an important part of future Canadian agriculture. And a lot of the research I'm doing is really filters into to all of these individual reports. And you know, even with, for example, Marie's talking about, you know, the trade-offs between resilience and farm profit, well, yield. It's like my 2020 survey in Ontario and the prairies, we're actively asking how do cover crops influence farm net profit, but we're also looking at all these different sort of almost environmental indicators and things we're looking for. So that's just one example there how we're doing very similar things and almost working together to achieve very similar goals.
So collaboration is certainly going to strengthen the value of yours and likely the other projects as well.
Okay.
What are the major barriers preventing cover crop adoption in the prairies?
Well, yeah, that was something which we really wanted to find out. And by far the most prevalent at the moment, it seems to be, is the climate. So the number one is the shortness of growing season. And the further north you go, obviously there's less windows and opportunities for starting a cover crop in the fall after cash crop harvest. So you're not going to get, and also you're not going to get a significant biomass, growth before the winter sets in. But also it's the lack of moisture in the fall. So it can quite often be difficult, particularly as you go further west in the prairies, to start your cover crop. But there's also farmers are concerned about how they're worried about financing cover crops, and they're also worried about labor and cost of equipment and such. But a lot of these could potentially be worked around with through increased education and knowledge of the benefits and such.
So, which leads to another question. What could be done to support farmers who wish to grow cover crops?
Well, I'd say listening to farmers themselves, and because in this project, we specifically asked farmers what problems they're facing, and we also asked them how these farmers, what would assist them growing cover crops. And we also asked them what they'd like to know from research and extension. So by actually listening to what these farmers are saying, we can assist them in a way that is farmer-led and farmer-derived, and anything that we do will fit in quite nicely there. So one of the most common things farmers are saying is they're needing financial support. One of the things they said most common was payments for storing carbon. Then we've got tax credits. Then they just said, in generally, if their farm is more profitable, they're more likely to grow them. And then it turns into more, they're wanting more research specifically to their local area, see how cover crops are working, and they want to see actual data which proves that cover crops are financially viable as well as providing environmental benefits. And many farmers also said they benefit from assistance on the ground with how to grow, manage, terminate cover crops.
Thanks, Callum. Your first point, though, is very valid, listening to the stakeholders. So thanks for that. There is one from an audience member, and it's for you specifically. Did you include the cover crop species diversity in your survey? Yeah. Did you include the CC species diversity in your survey?
Yes, we did. We were looking at the number of species in the cover crop. That was one of our objectives. So we had many cover crops are grown with just one species. The majority were grown as some form of a mix, quite a number between 2 and 5 species. But we had some farmers that were growing upwards of 12 species in their mixes. And in the prairies in particular, I'd say the most common species tend to be species that farmers can easily get a hold of relatively cheaply. So a lot of these are already common forage and annual grain crops. But then there was several really niche cash crops in there in these big mixes.
Thanks very much, Callum. I'm going to go on to Marie-Elise, but for the first 2 fellows, don't think that we're not coming back to you, so stay tuned. Marie-Elise, a general question to start off with. How does your research relate to the larger policy framework? I asked that earlier, and I'll ask that of you.
Yeah, of course. Well, I think I've took a few notes because answering in English was stressful for me, so I might have my eyes down a bit. But here I go. So in terms of policies, I think my research really show that there are no silver bullets in this, and that we really have to acknowledge the fact that agroecosystems are very complex, variable, and yeah, we really have to understand that and acknowledge that. So, for instance, the broad adoption of no-till practices in the provinces of the prairies has been great for yield so far, and it improves soil health, and we could store carbon in soil because of the broad adoption of no-till in these provinces. However, in Eastern Canada right now, soils are losing carbon because grasslands are slowly converted to cropland, and encouraging farmers to adopt no-till in in Canada could benefit surface soil health, but it could not necessarily increase crop yield or even store carbon in soil. So incentivizing these farmers for carbon sequestration in soil, if they adopt no-till, would make no sense in Eastern Canada. But incentivizing them for the adoption of cover crops, for example, could be a good idea. So I think my results show that strategies must be adapted to the pedoclimatic context of the farm, and all these little details about climate, about soil, about interactions between management practices must be considered before implementing policies. And yeah, this is why I think that environmental policies should have to be science-based, and that this requires a lot of soil data and some more research.
Thanks very much. Can I just ask you to keep your microphone closer to your mouth?
Yeah, sorry.
I think it might be on your it seems to be breaking up. So do you still think that the broad adoption of soil conservation practices is an effective way to ensure the resilience of our cropping systems and to fight against climate change?
Yeah, of course, I really think it is. I really think it is. And there are a few practices that we know very beneficial for climate change mitigation and for soil resilience, and that have very little trade-off possibilities in terms of yield, just like riparian buffers, windbreak hedges. Encouraging these practices on farm have very little effect on crop yield and could be very beneficial. Trying also to be careful in converting grasslands to crop, for instance, could be a great strategy as well. And of course, we've talked about it with Callum, but cover crops could also be a great way to ensure that under many systems, it could improve all ecosystem services provided by soils at the same time. So there are ways. I think just the challenge would be to quantify the benefits with certainty. That would be a challenge.
Thanks very much. A final question. You study the effects of tillage intensity, residue management, and fertilizer source on soil ecosystem services. But are there other practices, management practices, or technologies that could also be beneficial for both agroecosystems resilience and climate change mitigation?
Yeah, of course. Well, I've just said that, but cover crops, I didn't look into cover crops and green manures. During my studies, and all the stories about management of grasslands, pastures, there would be ways there to really soil carbon stock and soil health practices that I didn't talk about during my project. And also, I think we can add that due to the importance of roots in both soil health and carbon sequestration in soil, maybe developing perennial cereals, for example, would be a great way in the future to produce cereals in a more sustainable way. Or we could also play with genetics to develop crops that have a greater root system instead of just focusing on the grains, you know.
Yep.
Maybe they would have a few things there to really improve what happens in the soil and start only focusing on the.
Thank you. I have one final question from our audience at this point in time, and it says, as was mentioned in the opening remarks, working together and across fields is one of the keys to a more sustainable agriculture. However, discussions with other disciplines can often be challenging. How did you deal with multidisciplinarity in your research and in the group? And what were the challenges, and what did you learn?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think maybe next year it will be easier to talk about that, since we've worked on individual projects up until now, and we'll be working on the same project for next year. But I think it's very interesting to see that the study of agro-ecosystem requires an understanding of the processes that take place at very small scale and at a very large scale, and very different time scales as well. And what is great is that with Hannah, we have the small scale, she studies the scale at which processes occur. And then Callum and I try to go up on this a little and see how on-farm different factors will affect these same processes that Hannah is looking at. And then you have Lisa that tries to see, okay, now what do we do with all this knowledge, and how do we do to put it all together and make it work somehow? So I think it's, and I'm really looking forward to start working together, because I think we all know that this is such a complex question. It will require an integrative framework to find a solution to this great goal that we're trying to achieve together.
Thank you, Marie-Elise. I'm going to move on to Lisa now. Lisa, what do we do? This is a general question. What do we do with your knowledge and your research? Where do we take it?
Yeah, I think the other fellows did a great job in kind of leading up to that question. But I think with what particular to my research, it's an opportunity to identify kind of where Canada's at in its current approach, because frankly, addressing natural climate solutions within agriculture is a relatively new endeavor of the sector. So kind of identifying where we're at, and then identifying kind of where the current gaps are in our approach to governing natural climate solutions. And then I think with that knowledge, you can really start to develop clear pathways forward to address those gaps and to really build on the strengths that already exist. So yeah, I think with my research, you can really start to contribute to that process.
So specifically with your research, what are your next steps?
Yeah, I'm really excited about my next steps because it involves greater stakeholder engagement, which I hope to do through a policy Delphi, which is a facilitation method that really tries to allow different and very diverse stakeholders to start to develop common ground on a specific problem. So I hope to apply that to work with stakeholders so we can collectively identify pathways forward and what they think are kind of the best pathways forward to really enhance the adoption of natural climate solutions in the context of governance mechanisms. So thinking about what they think are the best governance approaches.
And so anything about synergies between the other three, your other three colleagues?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Marie-Elise did a great job kind of wrapping in how we all can tie in together and complement each other. But coming from more the policy, economic, social side, it's really important to build off of the other researchers' work to really look at what is scientific evidence in terms of informing policy, and how can that really be integrated to develop and design the most effective governance mechanisms. So using Callum's research, for example, and identifying where are the current gaps in cover crop adoption, and understanding from that survey kind of what are the current barriers. And that's really important to know when you're developing different types of programs, so you know kind of where they should be implemented, what the right price might be if a price or an incentive is required, and what other sort of challenges are they facing? Are they facing transaction costs? Or the current programs have really high administration expectations? And are there other challenges? So I think there's definitely really important synergies, and scientific evidence-informed policy development is really important.
Thanks, Lisa. A couple from the audience for you. Do you know of a model that's successful elsewhere where state, civil society, and the industry have collaborated on a national roadmap?
Yeah, so Ireland recently released their national climate roadmap. I forget exactly what the title is, but it was released in 2020, and it outlines what actions need to be taken now to enable them to reach their, I think it's 2030 to 2050 greenhouse gas reduction targets, specifically for the agricultural sector, and what type of knowledge they need to further develop to enable them to reach those more long-term goals. So that's a really great example. I believe New Zealand also has targets that are specific for the agricultural sector, and that really helps enabling actors to identify kind of what they need to do to reach those targets. But then it can also provide assurance to investors or other folks that want to be involved, because having a concrete plan sends a signal that you're serious about this action. So it can really spark investments and further innovation as well.
Thank you. Another question for you. How would your conclusions change in light of the recent federal funding, for example, $200 million for the Natural Climate Solutions Fund and ECCC's climate plan? A second question, if more data is needed for measuring and monitoring, where will it come from? And should the Federal Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada Department allocate more funding to data collection? Lots of questions there.
Yeah, so to address that first question, I did include those recent commitments in kind of my analysis and research, and it's really, really exciting to see that type of funding commitment, and then also just commitment in terms of resources to address this challenge. But funding is one part of kind of a system to really enable and develop a governance ecosystem that can foster natural climate solutions adoption. And like I mentioned, Ireland has a plan. New Zealand has really binding targets. So these types of more, I guess, framework governance mechanisms, in addition to funding, are also really important to address those challenges around lack of coordination and lack of understanding on what our shared goals are. So yeah, it's definitely part of that analysis. And then in terms of the data collection, within the federal budget, I believe there was a recent commitment for further development of remote sensing, which is a key aspect of measuring the impacts of practice adoption on greenhouse gas reductions from agriculture, along with farmer inputted data and soil samples. Those different types of tools all work together to enable us to have a better understanding of what the actual outcomes are from practice adoption. So there already is a financial commitment, but governance mechanisms like carbon markets and private companies setting ESG targets is also really driving a demand for better understanding what the greenhouse gas reductions are. So I think that moving forward, we'll see a lot more of public-private partnerships and private-private partnerships to really scale data collection, because there is such a demand for it now. As companies and countries set their net zero targets, they really need to be able to back up those targets and those claims with evidence from data.
Thanks very much. So I have another question. It's for the four of you, and we've talked a lot about collaboration and synergy. So but I'm just bringing it up again because someone raised it. Where do the four fellows see that they can collaborate on their group project over the next year? Is it around carbon storage? Is it around government policy? Or is it around incentives for farmers or something else? I'll ask each of you to say a few words. Starting with Hannah.
I think that's a good question. I think as both Mary, Elise, and Callum mentioned, we each talk about cover crops, and I think we've all talked about kind of different potential ways of building carbon storage. I don't know how well I personally could talk mostly about policy. It's really exciting to be able to work with people who can and use my data and see how that's had. But I think carbon storage or understanding how to mitigate for climate change is where I see.
Thanks. Callum?
I think personally we could work together on everything you said, but obviously I'd find some more easy than others, but I think an important thing is to work with others and learn from their areas of expertise. So I'd be excited to try something new and go down that. And it's the sort of thing like with my project is I didn't have a background in, surveys and listening to farmers, but I've loved doing it, and it's been one of the best decisions I've made. So I'm happy to expand into other areas I'm not familiar and learn from from my fellows. So.
Thank you. Marie-Elise.
Yes, I think with the four of us, we can really answer all those questions and answer those questions, but work on those questions together. You know, I see this as working on, yes, carbon storage in soil, but also how does carbon storage in soil impacts the profitability of the farm, because those questions have to be discussed if we want policies to work. So yeah, we have everything we need, I think, between the four of us together to talk about and to discuss the resilience of our agri-food system, carbon storage in soil, and profitability, on-farm profitability, and politics. So to me, all these together should make something great, and we won't save the world, but working the four of us together, I think it's going to be great. It's going to be great, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to it.
I'd go as far as say it's a powerhouse.
Yeah.
Lisa, talk to us.
Yeah, just to echo the other ones, I think the kind of opportunities of the questions we could answer are endless, and definitely not identifying silver bullet solutions, but providing more insight, like Marie-Elise mentioned, on kind of what the benefits are on the farm in terms of co-benefits, but then also what's that economic viability aspect, because that's so crucial. And then, yeah, no, I think that there's lots of opportunities, and I'm really excited for the group project.
Thank you. So I have another question for all of you, and this is from one of our listeners. Thank you for your great work. Now, how can we make sure all this valuable information is accessible to farmers and other stakeholders beyond academia? One question would be, would you like to start a climate solutions open source library? But you answer that question amongst the four of you. We'll go from the bottom up. Lisa.
I think that's a great idea. I think having those making research more accessible in terms of kind of what are the opportunities, and then what are the current tools we have right now to measure and monitor, and what are the other opportunities for different stakeholders to engage. I think those types of forums are really, really important and can really drive action. There's an example in the US, I believe it's called Open Team, where it's climate scientists and a group of more agricultural experts that are beginning to do this. And I think it's really important to start to develop those types of things in Canada as well to really drive momentum here.
Thanks. Marie-Elise.
Yes, well, as we can talk about the synergy between the four of us, I think it's important to consider also all the great organisms that are already out there trying to foster the transfer of science to farmers, and sometimes it's hard to reach in between different organisms, but some have strengths and other have other strengths. So I think just maybe reaching out to other organizations such as and I'm part of the board of Regeneration Canada, but that's their mission, you know, to talk about regenerative agriculture, and they put together people from the industry and farmers and citizens to engage together in this great movement. So maybe just reaching out and trying to once more work together with other group could be a good solution to facilitate the transfer.
Thank you. Callum?
I very much agree with what both people have just said. I feel that for anything we do to really have the maximum value, we need to make sure that everyone is involved. And again, that's kind of what I'm doing. Is I want this stuff to go directly back to the farmers just as much as I wanted it to go up to policy and researchers and extension. And I think we can work with that. And again, I had a lot of experience with trying to get out this survey, contacting, you know, various people in provincial governments, in you know, in all these different stakeholder organizations, you know, things like Organic Alberta, things like, you know, the Ontario Grain Growers, these sort of associations. So I think it's just working with all levels of stakeholders and making sure that science doesn't seem like something that only scientists have access to. Everyone needs to be able to be included and feel valued. And so I think that's just something we need to bear in mind. And
thank you. And finally, Hannah,
Yeah.
any extra additional thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a question I ask myself a lot in my type of research. I can, find as much as I want in a lab, but unless I understand the obstacles to implementing these practices, it won't get done. And if it just stays in a scientific journal, no farmer is going to see it. So it's really exciting for me to be able to work with people who do more economic and social science side of it, so I can learn how I can improve my communication. But I think this is a really important question and something that I'm actively trying to deal with and try to be better at. So it's really great.
Thank you. And so just to put you on the spot, Hannah, a question directly for you. Is flooding always considered a negative aspect of climate change? We've always learned how the Egyptians benefited from the flooding of the Nile. Is the negative aspect more about the cost to human infrastructure, i.e. roads and bridges, but actual flooding seems to benefit soil, as you suggest, based on your microbial activity? Thoughts?
Yeah, so I think there are ecosystems that are disturbance dependent, like the Nile. It needs that flooding every season and it's reliant on it for its growth, whereas a cornfield doesn't really need flooding every year for that growth. And I think my results, they don't necessarily paint a negative or a positive view of how flooding changes. Like I did see this increase in stable carbon, but it's more likely due from decreases in microbial biomass. So it's kind of a mixed bag. I'd be pretty skeptical myself if flooding in agricultural systems, especially crop systems, was beneficial to the soil. And I think it's much more about like what plants are growing in the ecosystem and the microbial community in and of itself, how they respond. But I'm pretty skeptical that corn and soybean will be pretty happy with flooding.
Thank you. Thank you. Callum, how many farmers did you find? This is from one of our listeners. How many farmers did you find in the 2019 that are using shoulder season cover crops? If so, how did they perform? And by the way, great information and research. Thank you. So the two questions: how many farmers did you find using shoulder season cover crops, and how did they perform?
Over the top of my head, I can't remember the exact number, but that's in the report, and the report will be freely available to everyone. But it was a very large proportion. In the 2020 survey, when you compare it to Ontario, almost everyone there is growing a shoulder season cover crop in the fall or in the spring, and hardly anyone's growing a full season cover crop. In the prairies, there's a lot more people growing full season cover crops. Still a very significant large proportion growing shoulder season cover crops, and there's a number of people actually utilizing both. But I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head. But that's great. And wasn't there a second part to the question?
Yes, sorry.
Sorry. My fault.
How did they perform? It was a performance question.
The 2019 survey didn't so much ask, it didn't go as deep as the 2020 in terms of actual performance. We didn't ask what benefits farmers have seen or how it affected the farm net profit. So that one, we could only really see why they were growing them. We didn't see their problems and such. But in the 2020 cover crop survey across the prairies, we saw that most farmers either saw an increase in their farm profitability or no change. Very, very few. I believe off the top of my head, it was less than 5% of farmers saw a decrease in the net profit. Although most farmers did experience some kind of problem, very, very, very few across both surveys said that their old system overall worked better. So that was something very surprising to me. There was, as I say, most farmers experienced at least one problem, but to most farmers, they didn't regret what they'd started doing, which was something to me which was really amazing.
Thanks. I have a question for Lisa. Lisa, is there an opportunity to transition from expert knowledge and verification systems to farmer engagement? This would interject more content-specific feedback and monitoring into farm management decision-making. Your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that maybe not necessarily a transition away, but better integration between more scientific knowledge, like those that like Hannah is producing, and then on-farm recording of kind of practice adoption and kind of the outcomes they're seeing. It's more of a systems approach rather than one or the other. But I will say some of the challenges around that is definitely data privacy. So ensuring that when farmers are inputting their farm management data, that they have the reassurance that when they do that, they know who's going to see it, how it's going to be used. And then it's also especially important so that they know what the outcomes for them are. So what are they getting out of doing this process? And I think having that back in terms of aggregated data, not necessarily seeing exactly what your neighbor is doing, but at an aggregated level can really also help inform decision making. So you know kind of how you compare against the top producers in your commodity or the top producers that are adopting cover crops, for example. So I think having that information and access to that information can really inform decision making on farms, but also really be a lever for driving improvements as well.
Thank you. Marie Elise, for you, thinking about your involvement in this 2-year program, what does success look like for your involvement in this program at the end of the 2 years? How will you know your participation has been successful or positive?
That's a really good question. And I think we've covered pretty much what I am going to say right now, but I think we're all here because we were interested in this systemic approach to the question. We wanted to grow from others to understand better the political view of our subjects and the small scale and the processes. So I think just learning from one another is a good start for us, but for our work in general, I think that being able to providing access to this information to the broader audience possible, and as it has been said, that all stakeholders have access to this information to maybe just make them thinking about these topics and seeing different perspectives. I think that would be a success. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I think we've just got a few minutes left, and I've got a couple more questions. One for Callum. In your research, Callum, were you able to determine if there was a difference in adoption of cover crops and or perception of value between those who use no-till versus conventional tillage? That was from a participant listening in.
I haven't as of yet, but I am wanting to separate out the between what we've done is we've grouped it into no-till, sort of various reduced till, and then tillage practices. So it is something I'm very much wanting to do, is be able to look at all these different groups of farmers individually, and it will be something very interesting.
Thanks very much. And so this last question is, I'll hear from each of you, and we will start at the top with Hannah and go down the list. According to your research, how is regenerative agriculture and biological agriculture, how can regenerative agriculture and biological agriculture reduce greenhouse gases, and what are the best practices to tackle climate change with agriculture? So you've talked about some of those things, but just give us a 1-minute overview about your thoughts around regenerative agriculture and biological agriculture and reducing greenhouse gases.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question.
Yeah.
And I think specifically when I'm thinking about mitigating climate change and carbon sequestration in my research, I'm looking at a lot of research focuses on this kind of stabilization and building our carbon pool, which is really, really important. I'm kind of looking almost at the opposite, at this destabilization. What happens when this carbon pool that we really think is stable and good is released and it actually decreases, and how can we mitigate against that? And so I think a lot of these kind of practices, buffer strips, no-till, low-till, cover crops that people have been implementing can actually really can apply to my work in terms of flooding, and that increasing root biomass with the cover crops and the buffer strips that changes the soil structure and makes lowers waterlogging of the soil. So potentially that's less of this release of the carbon. And kind of I think that these practices that we already know about can really be applied, and we just can get more benefits from it. But I think in a couple months to a year, I'll have a better idea of exactly how the practices can really impact.
Thank you. Callum, 30 seconds.
Well, I think there's great potential out there for regenerative agriculture, and what I find interesting about it, and what I'm talking to the farmers, is regenerative means different things, and I feel we actually need to define what these terms are. And even between Ontario and the prairies, and within the prairies, regenerative could be a trigger word for a lot of farmers. And then you actually speak to them, and quite often you find out they would meet what another farmer would class as regenerative, and they don't even know. So I think really we need first to really define all these terms. Where is sustainable? Where's regenerative? Where's all this? Because it can almost be a trigger word.
Lisa, or Marie-Elise, 30 seconds.
Yes, of course. So it is known now that the biggest impact we can have on climate change is really land management. So first thing is stop converting forests and grasslands to croplands. And the other thing with on-farm agricultural practices, well, carbon sequestration happens when plants perform photosynthesis. So you have to cover the soil you have to cover the soil in time and in space as much as you can in order to optimize photosynthesis and return carbon towards the soil.
Thank you. Lisa, you have the last word.
Great. I think they've already covered the specific practices, but just to say in terms of research, I think what the other fellows are doing is really informing that quite well. And a recent study was just released by Nature United, which outlined some of the greenhouse gas reduction potential of agricultural practices across Canada. And I think that's open access. So I think that's also a great resource to look to as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to each of the fellows. A wonderful webinar and information provided. Tyler, thanks for the opportunity to moderate this session. A powerhouse group here, absolutely a powerhouse group. And I'll be walking from here, from my office down to the Senate chamber shortly. And I'm going to be thinking about, and I will be telling folks that we are in good hands in agriculture because of these 4 individuals and many others that are working out there for the good of the industry and the sector. So thanks again. Back to you, Tyler.
Thank you very much, Senator Black. And I think we're in good hands when we've got legislators that are working nationally and provincially that understand how important these issues are, that understand how important and critical soil health is, not just to the future of a vibrant agri-food system, but to the future of a vibrant and healthy climate and economy. And again, I think that the work that our doctoral fellows have done over the last year in their individual projects, and will do together in their joint project, will really help drive that conversation forward. Again, I think the dialogue and engagement on some of the questions today really highlights how this is a very dynamic topic, and how when it comes to soil health, you can be looking at it from a a pure science perspective. You can look at it from the social science or public policy perspective. But really, if we want to have good answers, we need to look at it from all of those different perspectives together. And again, I think that's that interdisciplinary approach that we're really trying to embrace here at CAPI. And I think this is a great example of how we need to bring different people together to understand how the system works together. So again, thank you very much to our doctoral fellows. Thank you very much to you, Senator Black, and thank you to all of our participants and spectators that watched today. Again, the doctoral fellows reports are available up on the CAPI website. Please go and check them out. You can dive deeper into them and stay tuned for more details on the doctoral fellows program and the other work that CAPI is doing over the upcoming year. Please go to our website and join our mailing list if you want to follow along with us. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great day.